Okay, this tutorial will show you how to install Porteus onto a USB device that is EFI compatible. You can see I'm using Porteus 3.0.1 and the kernel is 3.14.15. This tutorial is only pertinent to installing Porteus onto a USB device. It uses the default fallback path for the EFI boot file, which is EFI/boot/bootx64.efi. If you're installing onto your hard drive, you will overwrite that default fallback EFI path. So with that out of the way, the steps that we will follow are to download the refined boot manager, download a nice theme for that boot manager, prepare the USB device in two partitions. The first one will be a small boot partition, the second one will be a Linux partition to house the Porteus files. We'll then format the partitions. We'll install the boot manager and Porteus onto the USB. We'll then add a custom Porteus configuration file, and then we will add that custom Porteus configuration file into the default configuration file. So download Refined. You can download that from rodsbooks.com, and Rod has provided a binary file for us, which is fantastic. We don't have to do any compiling. So click on that link and download the file. The other thing you'll need to download is the Refined minimal theme. That can be downloaded from GitHub, courteous of Evan Perkiser, and a screenshot of that is here. It's a very nice looking, minimalistic, clean boot screen. You can download that by clicking on the download zip button here. So the next step is to prepare the USB drive. In order to do that, I'm going to need to know where it's at, and typing in BLKID will give me a list of devices, and my USB device is here at dev SDB. So the tool that I'm going to be using to format the device is gdisk. So I type in gdisk/dev/sdb, and I find that it has detected my USB device, and the device has a GUUID partition table and a protective mother boot record. MBRs are used by the BIOS systems, and GPT is used by EFI systems. This is a newer implementation. This tool, gdisk, which incidentally is written by Rob Smith, who wrote the Refined boot manager. When you use this to partition your device, it will also install a protective mother boot record, and that's just so if you run an incompatible tool against your USB device and install a mother boot record, it won't nuke your device. So this is the tool we will use. I'm going to exit out of here for a second and show you how you can revert your USB back to its original state, which is not with a GPT, because you may want to use your USB at a later time in a machine that doesn't understand this GPT scheme, and so you'll want to revert back to something with just an MBR. To do that, you can use the tool parted. Enter parted and then the block device, no number, just in my case SDB. At that next screen, type mklabel ms-dos. Double check that you are indeed scrubbing a USB device and not some internal fixed drive, and answer yes, and that's done. Now I can quit out of there, go back into gdisk dev SDB, and you'll see now it has detected a mother boot record only. So a question mark gives us all of the available options. Our first port of call is to create a new and empty GPT. So the letter O and enter. Yes to confirm. The next step is to add a new partition. That's the letter N and enter. I press enter for the default number 1. Press enter again for the first available sector. The last sector, I want a 300 megabyte partition for the boot partition, so I enter plus 300 capital M. I then need to enter the partition type, or the hex code, so I enter capital L, which gives me a list. Now I'm going to be following the EFI standards here, so we're going to create an EFI system. You can use a normal Windows FAT32 partition, but we're going to use the code EFOO to create an EFI system type. Okay, first partition's done. Create the second partition by pressing N. We'll give it the default number 2, being the second partition. We'll use the next available sector on the device. I'll hit enter again, the last sector, which will use all of the remaining space on the device. And I'll hit enter again for the hex code, which will be 8300, and that's a standard Linux file system. With that done, I can now enter P to print the partition table, and you will see that I am about to create a 300 megabyte boot partition and a 3.5 gigabyte partition which will house Porteus. So I'm happy with that. I press W, yes, and that's writing the new GUID partition table now. Now that that's done, I can move on to the next step, which was formatting the partitions. Okay, don't forget that, it's kind of important. So I'm going to format the first partition, the EFI partition, SDB1, as FAT32. The EFI system partitions are required to be a FAT file system, and I just formatted that as FAT32. The second partition I'm going to format as ext2. Let's enter dev SDB2 for the second partition. So that's now formatting the partition. Now I can install the boot manager. If I go into the downloads folder, you can see that boot manager here. I can extract that folder. Inside you will notice a script called install.sh, and that's fantastic because Rod's written a script that means we don't have to do too much work. We can just run the install script, and the options that you want to pass to the script are, just let me change into the downloads folder. There's a list of files. You can see install is there. So I'll clear this just to give you a better view. The options are install, use default, dev SDB1, and then all drivers. That will install all of the file system drivers that we need. It's a quick procedure. That's all done. Now I can mount that first device, first partition, and show you now that at mount SDB1 there is a folder called EFI and then boot, and inside that are all of the refined boot manager files. So next step is to install the theme, and I'll unpack that theme here. You can see, because we downloaded from the GitHub download zip button, it has appended the word master onto the end of the file, and I want to get rid of that because all of my configuration files refer to this folder name, refined minimal. So there's the folder. I now need to copy that folder into the boot folder where I was before. So mount SDB1 EFI boot. Here we are inside that folder. I want to copy the home guest downloads refined minimal theme and copy that into the boot folder. Don't forget to use the recursive switch there. Okay, so that's done. If I look now, I can see refined minimal has been copied into into the Refind folder. Now, when I installed Refind, it installed itself as boot x64.EFI. This is the default fallback path for EFI systems to boot from, and because this is actually the Refind binary, it will look for its configuration file, refind.conf. I can remove this 32-bit stuff. I'm not going to be using it, so it's just taking up space. So I'm going to remove that 32-bit stuff. So I've installed the boot manager and the theme. The next thing on the list was to install Porteus. Okay, so we'll do that quickly. I'll mount the second partition, mount SDB2, and at this stage you need a Porteus ISO file. So just let me call up that. I'm going to install Porteus Razor. So I need to mount that ISO file on a loopback. You can see it's mounted there at mount loop. I can now copy the Porteus folder from the ISO onto the second partition. So that's copying in the background. So I've installed the boot manager, I've installed the theme for the boot manager, and I've installed Porteus. The next option, or the next step, is to add the Porteus configuration file. It's a custom configuration file. Now, everything so far is going into the boot folder here, and the Porteus configuration file will go here too. So it lives right next to the Refind configuration file. I'm going to open up the Porteus configuration file just to give you a look at what's there. Now you can pause this video or request this file on the Porteus forums and I'll provide it for you. These are all of the options available. If you want to learn more about extra options or exactly what these options mean, you can read more about those in the default Refind configuration file, which is very well commented. You can see there it's very well commented, so you can read all about them there. I'm going to give a quick run through and just explain what these options are. The scan drivers file means that it will look inside EFI boot drivers 64 and it will load those file system drivers. Here I am in EFI boot. If I list drivers 64, you can see all the file system drivers there, and the one that's relevant for me is ext2. This next option says to scan the configuration file for manual entries, which is these ones. It will then scan all the internal drives for other operating systems like Windows or Slackware. It will then scan all the external devices. When Refind scans the devices, it looks for EFI files and for Linux kernels. I have Slackware installed on one of these partitions, and this next option says don't scan files that have this name. Slackware has a couple of eLilo files and 2 kernels, so I don't want to load this generic kernel. So that means these won't appear in my Refind boot manager. I can also do the same for partition volume labels. So for example, the recovery partition has the label recovery, Windows recovery. I also have a Gentoo 32-bit install on a partition, and the label of it is Gentoo 32. So don't scan volumes. That means these will not appear as icons on this boot manager screen. Next option is the banner scale fill screen. That simply says that the background image, this nice blue gradient, will fill the entire screen. The last option is to use this Porteus version 3.0.1 as the default selection in the boot manager. Icon, don't worry about those. It's looking for them in EFI boot Refind minimal icons. You can see they're all available here. Refind icons. You can remove any of these OS underscore distro icons if you're not going to be using them. Don't remove the default OS_Linux. It'll use that icon when it encounters a distro that it doesn't have an icon for. Super important. This part, it will look for the kernel in the path UEFI Porteus version 3.0.1 and then the kernel. Now if I back up into the UEFI directory, you will see that that folder does not exist. So I create that folder, and now I need to copy the Linux kernel and the init_rd from Porteus, and that's still mounted on the loop at this stage, so I can go into boot folder, syslinux, copy those two files into the Porteus folder. Now if I look inside Porteus, there they are. So it's telling the kernel that it can, it's telling the bootloop manager that it can find the kernel inside there. It'll pass control there, which will load the init_rd, and then the next option is uses the from equals cheat code, and it tells us where Porteus lives and where to boot it from. So I'm using the UUID. To get that, type in blkid as root. That will give you the UUID. Porteus is on this second partition, dev sdb2. So I want to copy that UUID and put it into the configuration file. So this is the basic options that we're passing to the kernel. Any submenus for the boot manager are given like this. I just use the basic option here, and then for text mode I add 3, which will boot us into run level 3 text mode. Likewise for copy to RAM, I'm using the base options here and then adding copy to RAM. For people that are familiar with Porteus, you'll know that the base folder includes the default desktop. In this case, the default desktop module is Razor, and I can put into the Porteus optional folder any extra desktop modules that I may want to boot into. So in that optional folder will reside my XFCE desktop module, LXDE, KDE, Mate, whatever you want. And so this option says don't load Razor, but load XFCE. And that's all there is to the configuration file. The next step was to add this configuration file into the default refined configuration file. So to do that, we need to open that file up. I'm just going to search for the line number that I need where we add it. It's 352. So open up the refined configuration file and go down to line 352, around there. And there we go. You can see it's commented here, include a secondary configuration file within this one. So in this file I need to include the refined minimal/theme configuration file, and I need to include the Porteus configuration file. And so it's telling the configuration at this point in the refined configuration file, look for and load these other two configurations. And just to show you that they're there, there's the theme conf that exists, and there's the Porteus conf file that exists. And once you've done that, you've pretty much installed the refined boot manager and Linux and Porteus, and now it should boot. One thing I will mention is this is a very basic and minimalistic theme, and it doesn't even have instructions at the bottom, so I better explain that. To move between the different distro options, you use the arrow keys. If you want to bring up the submenu, you press F2, and then the submenu will drop down. And you can go back to this screen by pressing escape. If you want to actually access the options in the submenu so that you can edit them, press F2 once to bring the submenu, press F2 again. You can then edit the cheat codes or add a cheat code, and then press enter to boot. And this little arrow here will shut down the system. If you want more verbose output here, maybe instructions at the bottom or text for whatever option you've chosen, go into the theme file, which is inside refined theme. Right at the top you'll see it's using the option hide UI, and it's hiding the hints and it's hiding the label. And here you can see that the label is the boot option text label in the menu, and the hints is a brief command summary in the menu. So if you want those, you can just remove them. Remove label and hints from this this theme configuration file. So that's all there is to it. If you have any questions, you can find me at forum.porteus.org. Just join there and give us your feedback. Thanks very much.